When we think of the Middle Ages, we often romanticize this era with knights, castles, and grand feasts. But let's be real, life back then was also pretty weird, especially when it came to the law. Some of the rules they had was so bizarre, you won't believe they were actually real. So grab your popcorn, because we're about to explore the craziest laws from the Middle Ages. First up, let's talk about something called trial by ordeal. Forget courtrooms and lawyers. If you were accused of a crime, your guilt or innocence might be decided by, well, surviving something awful. One popular method was trial by hot iron. You'd have to carry a red-hot piece of iron for a few steps. Your hand was then bandaged, and if it healed cleanly after 3 days, you were innocent. If it got infected, which it almost always did, you were guilty. Another one was trial by water. You'd be tied up and thrown into a river. If you floated, you were guilty because the pure water was rejecting you. If you sank, you were innocent. Great, right? Except you might have already drowned. So it was a real lose-lose situation. It sounds absolutely terrifying. But for centuries, this was a legitimate way to determine justice. Now, let's move from people to animals. That's right. In the Middle Ages, animals could be put on trial. Seriously, if a pig, for example, was accused of harming a person, it could be arrested, held in nacelle, and then brought before a real court with a judge and everything. There are actual court records of this stuff. One famous case from 1386 in France involved a pig that was found guilty of mauling a child. The pig was sentenced to be maimed in the same way as the victim and then executed in the public square. And it wasn't just pigs. Rats, locusts, and even weevils were put on trial for destroying crops. They would be formally excommunicated by the church or ordered by the court to leave the area. Imagine being a lawyer whose job it is to defend a swarm of locusts. What a career! Fashion police is not a new concept. In the Middle Ages, they had something called Sumptuary Laws. These were laws that regulated what people could wear based on their social class. They were designed to keep the social hierarchy crystal clear. For example, only nobles were allowed to wear certain colors like purple or fabrics like silk and velvet. If you were a peasant and got caught wearing a fancy fur-trimmed hat, you could face hefty fines or even have your fancy clothes confiscated. These laws were incredibly specific, dictating the length of your tunic, the style of your shoes, and even the type of buttons you could use. It was all about making sure you knew your place and didn't try to look richer or more important than you actually were. Imagine getting a ticket today because your t-shirt is made of a material that's above your station. Speaking of social status, let's talk about football, or what they called football back then. It was a chaotic, violent game played between entire villages, often with an inflated pig's bladder as the ball. It was so rowdy and disruptive that several kings in England tried to ban it. King Edward II outlawed it in 1314 because he claimed the noise and chaos were distracting people from a much more important activity, archery practice. Back then, having skilled archers was crucial for national defense. So the government wanted every able-bodied man practicing with a bow and arrow, not kicking a ball around and causing riots. The bans didn't really work, though people loved the game too much and kept playing it in secret. Here's a weird one for you. The law of the beard. In some parts of medieval Europe, a man's beard was a symbol of his honor and virility. So if you were to, say, touch another man's beard without his permission, it was a massive insult. This wasn't just bad manners, it was a punishable offense. You could be fined for it. Why? Because grabbing someone's beard was seen as a direct challenge to their masculinity and social standing. So you had to be really careful with your hands. It makes you wonder what other seemingly innocent gestures today would have gotten you in serious trouble back then. And how about bedtime? There was often a curfew law. The word curfew actually comes from the old French couvre-feu, which means cover fire. At a certain time each evening, a bell would ring, signaling that everyone had to put out their fires and candles. This was mainly a fire prevention measure. With houses made mostly of wood and packed tightly together, a single stray spark could burn down an entire town. So the law forced everyone to go to bed, or at least sit in the dark. It was a practical rule, but it must have been a bit of a downer for anyone wanting to have a late-night party. Let's get back to some of the more brutal laws. What if you owed someone money? In some places, if you couldn't pay your debts, the law allowed for something called body as collateral. If you've defaulted on a loan, your creditor could legally seize your corpse. Yep, they could prevent your family from giving you a proper burial until the debt was paid off. This was a huge deal back then because a proper Christian burial was considered essential for getting into heaven. So, this law put immense pressure on your family to scrape together the money even after you were gone. It's a pretty grim form of debt collection, to say the least. Even marriage wasn't safe from strange laws. In medieval England, there was a law stating that a woman who seduced a man into marriage using scents, paints, cosmetic arts, artificial teeth, false hair, or iron stays could be tried for witchcraft. Essentially, if a man felt he'd been tricked into marriage because a woman used makeup or a corset to look more attractive than he thought she was, he could take her to court. It was a way of saying she used deceit and trickery to trap him. It is a pretty shocking example of how women were viewed and the kind of ridiculous standards they were held to. And for our final crazy law, let's talk about geese. In the medieval city of Basel, Switzerland, there was a law known as the Ginsemarsch or Goose March. Twice a year, all the city's geese were paraded through the streets to a public pasture. The bizarre part was that the law required the geese to be shoed. Special little tar and sand shoes were applied to their feet to protect them from the rough cobblestone streets. Can you imagine the sight? Hundreds of geese waddling through town in their little custom-made booties. It's a hilarious image, but it was a serious local ordinance. So there you have it, a quick tour of some of the most bizarre, brutal, and downright funny laws of the Middle Ages. From pigs on trial to fashion police and mandatory bedtime, it's clear that the past was a very different world. It really makes you appreciate our modern legal system, doesn't it? As wild as these laws sound to us, they tell us a lot about the values, fears, and priorities of the people who lived back then. What do you think is the weirdest law we talked about today? Let me know in the comments below. I'd love to hear your thoughts. Thanks so much for watching, and if you enjoyed this trip back in time, don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe for more weird history. See you in the next video!